Good morning. My name is Phill Conrad, instructor for CS 156 at UC Santa Barbara. I'm here with Scott Chow, who is one of the TAs for the course. And I am in the position this morning where I have made a pull request for one of our projects here. So I'm going to bring that up. And I'm at a point where I need Scott's help to figure out what my next steps are. Here's what's happened.
Are you sharing your screen?
I am. Oh, let me share my screen. So I have a pull request here, and the pull request is failing CI testing, and it is failing CI testing because if I actually go back and click on the little red X, the particular failure, if I click here on details, is in the NPM coverage. So I actually ran the test suite over here. I went into JavaScript and I did NPM test. And as we'll see, all of these tests pass. Oh, no tests found related to files changed since last commit.
You'll need to hit A if you want to run.
All tests, there we go. And we'll see everything passes. So that's fine. However, over here, what we'll see is that what it is actually complaining about is that the global coverage threshold for statements, 90% is not met. I'm at 87. 90% for threshold for lines is not met, and functions is not met. So what's happened is I've added a bunch of JavaScript code without adding tests that go with that JavaScript code. Naughty, naughty Phill. And Jest has caught me out here. So it's time for me to figure out what tests I need to write and how to write them. So Scott, how should we start? Should I maybe start by telling you what JavaScript code I changed? And then maybe we can look at, what tests I might need to write for that, or is there another way to do this?
I think the first place to start is to start with what the command is to get the coverage information locally.
Okay, let's do that.
If you go back to your terminal, instead of running npm test, you can do npm run coverage.
Got it. So this should be running locally the same command that was running in CI here.
Precisely.
And that way I can check as I make my changes, I can check the progress here without having to do a pull, having to submit another push and checking it on CI. Got it. So exactly. Here we see locally, I did npm run coverage and I got this same report that I got over here. So what I need to do is make changes until this is no longer red. Then I know that I should get the green check. Okay, so what's the next step?
If you scroll up, it'll actually tell you what files are missing coverage, and it'll also tell you on the right-hand side what lines are missing coverage.
Got it. So it looks like it's my basic course search form, and that makes sense because that is a new component that I added in this PR, and I didn't add any tests for it. So that was naughty of me, and now we're going to I'm gonna atone for that sin here. So I think what I want to do is go into Visual Studio, and I want to go under my JavaScript directory, and then under source, there's both main and tests. And the idea is that these directory trees should be parallel. And under components, basic course search, I have this basic course search form, but under tests, under components, I don't even have that directory. So I think the first thing I want to do is say, let's close these so that I have basically, I've got my main and my test here. I can see that under components, I have auth, basic course search, footer, loading, and nav. Here I have footer, loading, and nav. So I think I need a basic course search here. Looks like auth is also missing, but we're not going to worry about that right now. We'll come back to that another time. So basic course search. And then if I look at the pattern here, it's the name of the component, but test.js. So I think what I want is a file that has the name basic course search form test.js under here. So new file, basic course search form.test.js. All right. And I'm guessing that it's going to look similar to some of these. So maybe I can take one of these other tests and sort of use it as a starting point. I'm guessing that this is going to say basic course search form tests and renders without crashing. That's a good start. So maybe if I just do basic course search form and try to render it, that's probably a decently good start, except I also need to import that. So that's going to be basic course search form, and it's going to be from main components. Will it autocomplete for me? No, that would be too easy. There we go, basic course search, but I think it's actually basic course search slash and then basic course search form. All right. So how am I doing so far, Scott? Does that look reasonable?
Yeah.
All right.
That looks reasonable. You can rerun the coverage.
Oops. Try that again. npm run coverage. And okay, so let's see. It looks like I'm still below the threshold. All right. Still have some uncovered lines in basic course search form.js, 23, 24, 29. So let's take a look more closely at those lines.
Yeah.
I have a hunch what it is. Yes, indeed. Okay. So let's talk through this. I know you and I, Scott, have talked through this code before, but for the sake of the students watching this. So what is this form that I've made here? Well, it's basically a form that allows you to put in the quarter, the department, and the level. Here's what it looks like when we run it. So if I go up a directory and do maven spring boot run, and I'll go ahead and make another terminal in this same folder so that we can also be looking at, we can just leave that running. Let's see, it's UCSB courses search, and they'll cd back down into JavaScript. And I'll do that npm run coverage again. So it'll take a minute for this to come up. But basically what's happening is we're specifying a quarter, a department, and a level like undergrad or all or graduate. And when we hit the submit button, this handle submit function is called. And when it is called, it tries to call this fetch JSON event. This fetch JSON is asynchronous. So when it returns, the course JSON that's returned is passed into this set course JSON method. And that is what displays the results. This fetch JSON method actually talks to the back end. And it waits for that response to come back. And when it does, it sets, it actually returns the course JSON, which is then set. The setter sets it as one of the state variables. And what I'm guessing is it's these lines of code here. If I look back at my coverage report, because all we did in our test was render the component, but we didn't actually try doing anything with it. So lines 23, 24, indeed, 23 and 24, the fetching JSON, this is like not happening. So I think now that I've got the, now that I've got this up in a web browser, I should be able to show on localhost 8080, basically show, okay, you select a quarter, you select a department, you select a level, you hit submit. And what's happening right now is the backend isn't getting the courses yet, but it is echoing back the selections that we made. So we're able to just test that the front end and the back end are talking to each other properly. If I change this to F20 and hit submit, it changes to 2024, which is the internal code for fall 20. All right, so what do I need to do, Scott, in my test to exercise that, that other code?
Yeah, so we're going to need to do a couple of things. So while rendering the component and making sure that rendering the component by itself doesn't have any ill effects, the next thing that we want to establish is when you actually interact with the component as it would be in like your web page, we want to verify at least we want to exercise the capabilities that we've given it. Right. So all of those functions we've declared, all of those handles we've declared, we need to actually exercise them in order to get coverage.
Right.
So while that sounds scary at first, what it means is basically we need to actually just interact with the rendered element, which luckily, because we're using React testing library, there is a sister library called user event that we have. And that is what we are going to use to basically mimic user interaction. So like if Conrad clicks and selects something, so clicks and selects computer science, we can actually model this interaction with the browser in our test.
Gotcha.
So that's what we're going to do. We're basically going to write a couple of tests to exercise this functionality.
Gotcha. All righty. So what's our first step here?
So I would say our first step is to decide what flow we want to exercise. Like, do we like? It's easier to go from like some user interaction, like set of user interactions we want to model, and like start with like an expected, like I click on these things and I hit this button and I get.
Got it. So maybe a place to start is the default on this, at least right now, is it comes up in Winter 21, Computer Science, and Undergrad all are the defaults. And we can see that in the code, I believe, because when I set up the state, so the state is how the component remembers what quarter, department, and level are currently being, are the current settings. And I've set these up as the defaults. And then also down in the form, I have the value of, I guess the defaults are probably just whatever is the first thing on the list. Is that what's happening as the defaults here? Or I guess I didn't really, oh, I see. The defaults are coming from the fact that the value equals, that's going to be the default. And that's coming from the fact that I set these state variables here, and then I use those values, quarter, department, and level, as the default values, right? So I think it's the case that these defaults are set right here in one place. And I think what we probably want to do is check that if the user selects something other than the default, and let's maybe select something other than the default in every case here, that works properly. So that I check this, and then I would expect what's supposed to happen is since I have this on change handler quarter change, if I change from whatever my default is up here, which I think is Winter 21, it is. If I change from Winter 21 to Fall 20, I would expect this value to change from the value of quarter to change from 2021-1 to 2020-04. So maybe that's the first test we should write. And I might do something like, it's like test when I select a quarter, the state for quarter changes. Is that the kind of test I would want to write?
Yeah, that's so in this case, right, we actually can't examine the internals of React. So while we do want the state for quarter to change, we can only examine that property as it like affects the DOM that we see.
Got it. Got it. So in this case, unless there is something on the page that changes when I change from like winter 21 to F20, unless there's something on the page that changes, there's nothing I can really test. Is that correct?
Precisely. And in this case, there is actually something that changes. So
Right.
if you go ahead and right click on the select element that you have, if you right click and inspect element.
So let's see, right click. I probably need to right click here. And then
Try digging
this,
into that.
yeah, here we go.
Yeah.
So what's
So you
happening?
see how we have,
You first.
yeah. So you see how we have this select element, right? And we notice, for example, that, okay, we have this select, it has an ID on it, right? And then it has, you know, some form control class, and then it has the two options, right? So at the outset, it doesn't seem immediately apparent, for example, like how you can tell which one is which, right? Because it's like, this is what we're going to see, right? So if we try, for example, going into the DOM and changing it, right? The first question is, do we see any updates do we see any updates? So like if we go on the left-hand side and actually change what the value is for the quarter, right? And here we notice that there doesn't seem to be any updates.
Yes.
Right. So that actually, that might make things a little bit tricky.
However, I have a question. I'm wondering if this select, even though there's nothing visible, if I look in my HTML, now this is actually, I mean, this is not HTML, it's JSX, right? But it's sort of HTML-like. I'm wondering if this select element actually has a value property that we could inquire about.
It most likely does, right?
Yeah.
So there's a couple of things. If we were to give you a moment to think about this. So what you can do actually to kind of test this is, so because you've clicked, so if you click on that DOM node right now.
This one here?
Yeah, if you just click on it, and even just highlighting it is enough, we can actually play with it in the console, right? We can actually examine it. So what we want to do is we now want to go to the console.
Got it.
And what you want to do is $0. This means whatever was currently selected. And you'll notice how it immediately pulls up that, right?
Yeah.
So now, so if you're familiar with the $sign syntax, this means we're using something called Jquery. If you're not familiar with what that is, it's just a tool that helps us find things in the DOM, right? So now we can go ahead and, for example, say do like .value, right? And we see here, we can actually interrogate it and we get the value. If we go ahead and change it, and you hit up to retrieve the previous statement or type it again, you'll see that updates, right?
Yes.
So yeah, even though there's no visible changes, we can actually still interrogate the DOM element to get what we want.
Gotcha.
Right?
So just to emphasize this, let me go back to elements here. And if I go down and select this select instead, so this is the one for math. Now, if I go to my console and do $0, it does. It's the basic search for department. And if I do $0.0.value, I would expect it to say math, and it does. And if I change this to CMPSC and do $0.0.value, it now says CMPSC. Got it. So I think this suggests then that a test we could write. Well, I still don't know exactly how to write the code though, but I think what I want to do is I want to render the form. Then I want to do something like change the quarter from winter 21 to F20. Then I want to ask for, and it looks like there is basic search.quarter. I want to ask for the element with basic search.quarter as the ID, and then check whether its value, its value is F20. Is that the basic shape of the test I want to write?
More or less, yeah.
Okay.
You want to, yeah, exactly. And most of that begins with you being able to identify the node, right? So then the question becomes, how do you get a reference to that node in particular, right? And this is what the role of the queries in React testing library are, right? So I think what might be instructive is if you really quickly go look at another component that has something like this. So for example, we have app footer test even, or pretty much any of the other things. Actually, maybe not app footer, but yeah, something even like app navbar that actually works. So if we look at this, right, you'll see that render actually returns an object with this thing that looks like a query, like get by text, right? It looks like, and it's actually a function, right? Yeah. So what that is it's known as a query. And these queries, there's different flavors of them that return different things. But in this case, get by text will return you the one node that matches and has the text value that you pass it, right? And it accepts strings and it accepts regexes. If it finds more than one value with that text, it throws an error.
Gotcha.
Right. So there's different flavors of these things, right? And there's different properties you can look for, right? Now, the question is basically, how do we go about actually, how do we want to go about identifying our different DOM nodes, right? And there's a variety of different ways, right? So for example, it might be possible, and this is where a little bit of trial and error comes in. In this case, one of the most straightforward ways to do this is if we tag the DOM nodes that we want to identify with a property called data-test ID or data-test-ID. There's actually a query for get by test ID in React testing library. Gotcha. Now this is considered like the sledgehammer, right? Like if everything else goes wrong, you can always do this.
Right.
Right.
So let's just, since we mentioned it, let's just show what that would look like. Exactly. What that means is I go into my component up here, basic course search form, and this form control here, this is the select. I would do something like data hyphen, was it test ID?
Test-ID.
Test-ID.
Test, yeah, test-ID.
And then is this going to be a braces or is it going to be quotes?
Now it's, in this case, it can be quotes as long as like the string doesn't depend on anything, right? Gotcha. So like if we're just doing a raw string here where it's like, you know, quarter input or however, whatever ID you want to provide it, right? Then we can reliably identify it.
So if I say something like quarter selection, or even just quarter, maybe I should do quarter select. So it's the select element for quarter, or select, maybe let's do select quarter. So then over in my test, what would I do?
So you would change the query that we're retrieving to not be get by text. We would say instead get by test ID. And if you're wondering where these are coming from, you're like, you just changed the name and you just got it. Like, what's going on there, right? What's happening is that there's actually all of these different queries being exported by the render method. We are just only taking the one we want, and then we're dropping the rest on the ground.
Got it. So, but I could, for example, if I needed both, I could do here get by text, get by test ID, and then I could use both of them. Got it. Okay, but in this case,
Precisely. So you only ask for what you want, and then you leave everything else alone.
Gotcha.
Is the idea.
So then I could write get by test ID, and I guess I would pass in that select quarter, and then I could do something with it.
So precisely. So, well, in this case, what we want, right, is at the moment we just want the reference to it, right? So the most common pattern I use is basically I get a reference to it and I name it immediately, right? So I say const like quarter select or select quarter, right? I make a variable out of it, right? Because now that I have this DOM element, I can now pass it to different things that interact or assert things about that DOM element, right? So the one we're going to want to use now is we're going to want to use something called the user event, right? So if we go to the top and we import user event from @testing-library/user event, so no, it's not under the same umbrellas. It's a sister repo.
Got it.
So it's import and it's just the default import. So it's not even in braces. Yeah, so this is a little bit frustrating because they do export slightly differently, but it's the @testing library family, and it's going to be /user event precisely.
Got it. Okay.
So this gives us access to user event, which is probably one of the neater things to come out of the testing library besides the whole testing library framework itself. So user event is really neat because what we can do is user event dot select. And what we want, and give me a moment to retrieve the example. I had the example on my other screen. And what we can do is do select options actually. So the method's called select options, right? And what we're going to pass it is the first element is going to be the target element, you see, right? So we're just going to pass it a reference to select quarter, and then comma. And then what we want to do is pass it the values, right? So in this case, we only have one value because we have a single select, right? So we say, for example, if we want to select F20, right, then we would pass it F20. If we, for some reason, had a multi-select, you could pass it an array of strings, right? So if we do that, right, what we can then do to make this like a nice short, like self-contained test is we can now say, okay, we still have a reference to select quarter. We can go down to the bottom and we can say, for example, expect, or well, bottom, we can now expect select quarter dot value dot to be. It's not to.b, it's to be camel case. And then in this case, we expect it to be F20 or 2021 specifically, right?
24, right.
Or something.
Because the value of the elements here is in this different format, right? Because that's
exactly, and that's a really common mistake. You see, I just made it, right?
Yeah,
It's very common for your input to look like something user facing, but the actual value needs to be something understood by the backend, right? So that's actually a self-contained test right there. So if we actually just run that by itself, we can actually examine hopefully whether or not this pattern works.
Gotcha. So let's just check our statement and branch coverage is now like at 45.45. So we'll see if it goes up. But first, I can just run the test, right? Which would be
well, you could
go ahead.
In this case, there's no significant difference between running npm test and npm run coverage.
Okay.
They both run all the tests, and the test suite is not big enough at this point to warrant picking out the specific test.
Right. If we had a huge test suite that took a long time to run, we might want to run just the one test.
Exactly. So we have one failure, right? And if we wander up a little bit, we can actually see why it failed. So get by test ID, right? And so it said it was unable to identify anything with this.
Yes.
Right. So if we scroll up, you'll actually see it actually printed the DOM as it saw. Right. So this is the DOM as it sees it.
Okay. And so it didn't see the, it didn't see that. We tried to put that data test ID on, but it didn't find it.
So if you keep going up a little bit, we see, and we see there, it's actually data. There's no dash between test and ID. So I was actually incorrect.
Got it. So if we go back to here and change this, just take out that hyphen and try the test again.
Precisely.
All right, let's see.
And now we move on to the next problem.
So it's still, we still haven't affected our test coverage, it looks like.
That's because the test failed.
Oh, the test failed. All right.
That's because the test failed, right? So user event.select options.
So it doesn't like user event.select options.
And if we go up, it's actually probably because it doesn't take F20 as a value. It wants the actual value. So the same mistake that we were about to make with the expect, we need to propagate that change to the
gotcha.
To the,
so instead of the select quarter, when we do the select, instead of selecting by the text that's visible here, we have to select by the value under the hood that corresponds to that option, which is like the 2024 in this case.
Precisely.
Gotcha. All right. So let's change this to 2024. If we did want to select by the visible text, I'm guessing there's probably a way to do it, but let's defer that for right now.
Yeah. That gets a little bit more complicated.
Yeah.
You'd have to identify that node by text, and then you'd have to go and retrieve its value.
All right, good. Well, we're making progress. It was 45.45, now it's 50. So we're making progress. So that suggests that maybe we should do this same thing for not just quarter, but also department.
And actually, I'm reasonably certain this will work too. So get by test ID is considered a little bit of a sledgehammer.
Yeah.
Right.
Let's do it a different way.
You ideally don't want to do by test ID, not necessarily because it's super bad, but you want to, usually you want to try to ground your tests in like the things that actually exist in the DOM.
Right.
Right. So if I renamed, like if I relabeled everything to have completely bogus names, the test might still run, but the user might not actually be able to distinguish what any of the values are for.
Right.
Right. If I like renamed like quarter to bologna, like what type of bologna sandwich do you want? That should be a problem.
Yes.
Right. So the good thing is that there are a good number of pre-existing queries. One of them is specifically made for forms, and it's called, I believe, get by label text.
Gotcha. Gotcha. That makes a lot more sense. So we're going to do get by label text. There it is.
Label text. And what that does, it says, and I think this is best motivated by like what we actually see in the React form, in the React thing, right? You'll notice that exactly. Yeah. For department, I want to get the form element that corresponds to it. And I think it's even more obvious when you look at the actual React code. You'll notice that in each of these form groups, you'll see a label and a control. Right now, to be fair, this is specific to the UI library that we're using, right? But in principle, it's universal to all HTML forms. Right. If you have a form, you can provide a label and an input, and the two should be paired together.
Yes.
Right. So that's what's happening here. Right?
And just to jump in for a second, this is JSX code. This is the way we write this in React. This ends up rendering as this HTML, and you can see that there is a div class form group. There's a label class form label for basic search quarter. This for and this ID connect these together. And this is probably how the testing library is actually figuring this out from this,
precisely,
this rendered stuff here.
Precisely.
This for element. Gotcha. So we probably want to just take the word quarter and pass it in to.
That's the idea.
got it. So let me go back over here, and we're going to get by label text.
And in this case,
Actually,
we probably want to
it's
do department.
Right.
Yeah.
Got it.
And the nice thing is that, well, while technically the name of the variable select quarter should probably be select department, and we should update the values we're selecting, in principle, the shape remains identical.
Yes. So this will be math, and this will be math, and this will be department.
And the expect will also be select department.
Got it. All right. Now, when we do get by label text, one question I have is, are we getting this, or are we getting the whole form group? Are we getting this label? Like, is it going to... Go ahead.
Yeah, you're getting the input object that is pointed to by the 4.
Got it. Okay, since this is a 4 basic search department, I am going to get this thing. So I'm getting the same thing that I got up here.
Yes, you're getting the same thing. Yeah, exactly. But the idea is that the test is a little bit more readable.
Yes. Yes.
Right. Get by label text department. Okay. Select math. Okay. That makes, it reads a little bit more like English.
And if I were to change this department to something else, it's good that it matches here. And I didn't have to put in, for this other one, I had to modify my code and put in this extra thing just for test purposes. Here, I didn't have to modify my code at all.
Precisely.
All right, so let's see what happens when we run this one. We were at 50. Let's see if our test coverage goes up for that one component. And it did. It went up to 54.55. So we are making good progress. Let's go ahead and do this for level as well. And I think for level, we should probably be able to just use this same pattern. The state for level changes, select level, and let's see, our default level is U, so I should use something other than U. And my options here are L, S, U, and G, so let's do G. Select G, and this will be level, and this will be level. All right, so I'm at 54.55. All right, I have a failure. Let's see what I failed. Get by label text level. And the failure is, let's see, does it say level? Oh, it says course level. All right, well, that's good. Let's change this to course level and try it again. And this time, no failures. And we're at 59.09. And it also appears that we might actually be above our threshold of coverage here. But, since we're at this, why don't we see if we can, get a little bit more coverage, right? Because we still have some uncovered lines here. At this point, though, we probably could just force this on through. We could sort of declare victory, right?
Yeah, you could. The 90% threshold is actually just the default provided by Jest.
Got it.
So at some point, we should probably tune that probably closer towards 100%. But yeah, the general idea is like, yes, you do it until you meet the threshold. If you decide the threshold's all you need, then
right.
You
so, and let's be clear that there's 100% test coverage is not always the goal you should shoot for, because there is a point of diminishing returns when writing tests. There are some times when getting from 98% coverage to 100% coverage is not a good use of your time. However, in this case, I think there probably still are some tests we could write that would be a good use of our time.
Yeah.
That's my
And- yeah.
guess, right?
And typically what happens when you bump into those cases that are like diminishing returns are usually cases that revolve around code that you didn't write, but
Mhm.
is written in such a way that you can't adequately mock or stub it.
Right, right,
That's usually the biggest problem. And usually what ends up happening in those cases is you end up finding a way to just ignore those files from coverage. So
right.
in this case, you mentioned earlier how the auth components were
Mhm,
did not have corresponding tests.
mhm.
And that's because I ignored those files
Got
from
it.
coverage. And the precise reason that I ignored those files is because those are boilerplate,
Yes.
generally speaking, and they're boilerplate that directly invoke auth0.
And just in case,
So there's actually,
let me pause for just 1 second just to explain.
yep,
Boilerplate means basically just copy and pasted code. It means code that when you use auth0, the auth0 documentation says you should write the code exactly like this. And you just kind of copy it and paste it from the documentation, and it always looks the same. That's kind of what we mean by boilerplate code. Is that an
precise.
adequate, just in case people aren't
Yeah.
familiar with that expression?
Yep. Yep. That's
Go ahead and continue.
that's the correct thing.
And
Yeah.
actually, one question,
So
where did you, I assume there's some configuration
yeah.
file where you
So
told
it's
it,
in the package.json.
got it. Let's take a look at that right quick. So that package.json is at the top level under the JavaScript directory, I believe. So here
Yep.
under
And
JavaScript,
if you scroll on down in the file towards, you'll see a part where it says, yeah, there we are, Jest,
got it.
right? So everything under Jest, right? So collect coverage from. So it says, please, the line 35 says, collect coverage from everything under source
Mhm.
in any subdirectory
Yep.
that begins with any name, that ends with .js, JSX, TS, or TSX. If you're curious
Right.
what TS and TSX, that's TypeScript.
Got it.
The exclamation mark means do not include the surface worker, do not include setup tests, do not include anything under the auth folder in main components, and do not include the index.js.
Right. So if I were dastardly, I could have also solved this problem by doing the following thing, which would be bad. It would be naughty. I could just go in and say, hey, I made basic search, whatever I called it.
Yeah, basic search form.
Basic course search.
Yeah. Yep.
But I don't want you to check on my test coverage. And hopefully, when someone did a code review of my pull request, they would see this and go, dude, come on, that's not nice.
Yep.
Unless you've got a really good reason, you should be subject to test coverage. So this is kind of the nuclear option that you only use if you've got a really, really good reason. And if you see this on a code review, you should make the person really provide a really good justification for why they did that thing.
You can also see right below it, that's actually where we define the coverage threshold.
Right. This is the other place where I could say, oh, we'll just bump this down to 80. And that would be, again, a sort of a dastardly way to get around this. But the way we're doing it is the right way, to actually look at the code and see, are there reasonable tests we can write? Which brings us back to lines 17 through 24. So let's take a look at lines 17 through 24 and see what they are doing. So line 17 is returning course JSON. And so it's still all of this like handling the submit. So we have not done anything yet that actually involves clicking the submit button. So I'm guessing that's our next sort of course of action. Yeah.
Yeah, that is correct. So the next step, broadly speaking, is to test how the component reacts when we actually hit the submit button. And this is typically where testing gets a little bit more complicated. Like there's the previous step of like, okay, how do I interact with the DOM? And now we actually have to mock something for the first time, because if if you've been following along, you might have realized that, wait a minute, it's actually going to try to make a call to that URL if we run the test and we hit the submit button. So like,
Let me
how do
just
we
pause
resolve
there
that?
and just to make sure folks are getting what's happening here. When I click the submit button, like right here, for example, what is happening, the reason that that changed is because it went to the back end and this came back from the back end. Now, eventually what's going to come back from the back end is all of the graduate computer science courses for fall 20. That's kind of my next, that's the next issue that the team and I are going to work on, and there'll be a separate pull request for that. Right now, the back end is just kind of a stub that echoes back the parameters that were sent to it. But you can see what's going on if I go to localhost 8080 and just put in a search here. And actually, this is supposed to be DEPT. There we go. So whatever I put in for quarter, oops, let's bring that, not that. There we go. Whatever I put in for department here, in fact, I can even put a completely bogus department, not exists. And it will come back. Like whatever I put in for quarter, department, and level, I can put in, the level is 8. And that just comes back. So that's what's happening right now with this. And what Scott's saying, that what we want to do in our test is not really talk to the back end, but mock the back end, because this is not a test of the back end. This is only a test of the front end. So this basically, go ahead.
Yeah, so actually mocking the backend it's a little bit misleading. We're not actually mocking the backend. What we're actually gonna do is we're gonna mock the fetch function.
That's right.
Which is like, we're gonna, because we don't actually have control over what's at the other end of that URL in general. What we do have control over is the function you call to actually go and do that. So we're gonna do something, which is we're gonna just, replace the entire function.
Yes. So this function fetch is the one that in real life, I pass in the URL, and the await means, well, gosh, we don't know how long the backend is going to take, but when it does return, I will get back a result, which I will convert to JSON, and I will assign to this variable right here. And that's why you see down here, when we call this whole method is an asynchronous, I shouldn't say method, this function is an asynchronous function. I have this then construct here. That's because what this returns is something called a promise. And you use the then to say, okay, I promise when I return, I will invoke this function that you've passed in with the then. So whenever this returns, the course JSON comes back, the result of this function gets passed into this little arrow function here, which then sets the course JSON, and that's how it ends up appearing down here. So if I hit submit, oh yeah, I think, okay, right, this one right now is returning a promise. I think this is, not sure why.
Probably because the backend, well, that could be for a variety of reasons.
Yeah, but let's defer that and just get focused back on what we're doing here. So I guess we want to mock the fetch method.
Yeah, so we do want to mock the fetch function. And so, but let's first figure out like what we want to do to get up to that, right?
Got it.
So in this case, I would probably say like, let's keep the test succinct. Let's just maintain the defaults, right? And basically all we want to do is we want to click the submit button and then verify what happens, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I would start with rendering the course's basic course search, and I would actually extract the get by text query.
So get
and
by.
All we're going to do is get by text, and we're going to just go straight for the submit button. We're going to do user event dot play. Well, we're going to get the submit button.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to say const
submit button equals get by text.
And we're
And
just, I think it just says submit.
yeah, that's right. And as long as it's the only thing on the page that says submit, this should work.
Yes. If there are multiple things on the page that say submit, you can actually do get all by text.
Right.
And it'll hand you an array of these elements, and then you extract the particular one you want. But
So
at
then
that point, that's a different problem.
user event dot submit
Click.
button dot.
No, it's not user event dot submit button, right? So we're calling a method on the user event library.
Click.
So in this case, click, yes, and we're passing it the thing we want to, yes.
Got it. Okay.
Sorry about that.
Okay. So for those of you who are just arriving, Scott and I are in the middle of recording a video about testing. So we will wrap this up soon, but if you can just kind of look on for now, because this is some good stuff for all of us to know. So we are figuring out how to test this component that Mara and I worked on yesterday. And we're at the point of testing the submit button. So Scott, what happens next here?
Yeah, so once that user event .click occurs, that's what's going to trigger the call to fetch, right? And now would be the point where we would, either finish writing the test, run the test, see it fail, right? And then come back to this problem, or we can just solve the problem right now.
Yeah.
So in order to, so let's, so what we're going to need to do to mock the Jest function, or sorry, the fetch function, is we're going to actually need to go up to our imports first.
Yes.
And this is where things get a little bit interesting, and we take advantage of some of Jest's more complex features. So what we're going to do here is we're going to import fetch the same way that we import it in the file that we want to mock it in. So we're saying import fetch, and I believe, I believe it's from isomorphic on fetch.
Gotcha. So that's the real honest to goodness fetch.
So yes. And then what we're going to do is we're going to do jest.mock. So there, jest.mock.
Right, okay.
Right there on line 5. What we're going to do, jest.mock, what we're going to do is we're going to mock out the file, or AKA the module that we're importing fetch from.
So it doesn't like when I type J, it does not like Jest. It like keeps trying to.
You need to not let it autocomplete, because it's taking advantage of what it's read in your
So sometimes VS Code, mostly VS Code helps you. Sometimes it hurts you. So jest.mock.
If you hit escape, it'll decline the suggestions.
There we go. That's good to know. So I do jest dot, and it tries that, and I do escape, and it still doesn't.
Well, you have to do it before it.
I see.
I'm not sure how you're accepting it, but you seem to be accepting the suggestion. But that's not the point of this. So.
Yeah, I think what happens is I get here, and if I need to hit escape before I hit the dot.
Yes.
There we go.
That is correct. So just.mock.
Mock. Okay. Fetch.
And what we're going to do is not fetch, actually. What we're going to do is we're going to mock the module. So we actually want to mock isomorphic on fetch.
And do I need quotes?
And it needs to be in quotes, yes.
Okay.
Isomorphic
on fetch. Okay, got it.
Yeah. So I'm not going to get into like all of like what's happening here, but needless to say, to review this, a JavaScript module is basically means the same thing as a file, right? It is some JavaScript file. Technically, it's a little bit more complex than that, but generally speaking, you can think if I export from a file, that's a JavaScript module.
Yes.
Right. So, and that creates this module object with all of the exports. So that's the reason, for example, that we can do destructuring like we're doing with import render.
Yes. From
testing library React, right? So by mocking out the module, we basically say everything in here is now a Jest mock object.
Okay.
And so because we've done that, and because fetch is the default export, fetch is now mockable.
Got it.
So now we can treat fetch as a mock object, or
Okay.
which is what allows us to, now what we're going to do is we're going to mock its return value, for example.
Yes.
Right? So now we can go down back to our test.
Mm-hmm.
And what we want to do on line 38, actually before we set up the test, is we want to mock what the behavior of fetch should be, right? So we want to do fetch dot mock, and here's where it's going to be slightly different depending on what you're mocking, right? So one way we could do this is mock return value. Right now, if fetch return just a typical object, mock return value is great, right? So this is really good if you're mocking out something like a hook or something like that. The problem is that if we look at fetch is not returning just a typical object. It's actually returning a promise.
Yes.
Right. So in that case, you don't use mock return value, you use mock resolved value.
Which I think is going to mock the value that gets returned after the promise resolves.
Precisely.
Got it.
So it will return a promise with the resolved value that you're about to pass it. Now, this is where things get tricky, because your initial guess right here might be to immediately return like a JSON string.
Mm-hmm.
But we need to look at how it's being used. So if we go back to basic course search form.js, right?
Yeah, we do notice JSON on.
We do a .json on it, right?
Yes.
And that's where it gets a little bit more complex, right? Because we can't actually just provide it, like the JSON string. Instead, what we have to do is we have to what the mock resolved value needs to be. It needs to be an object with the field JSON. And JSON needs to be a function that returns our thing. Right. So JSON here is actually a function. So it's parentheses arrow, and its job is to return the JSON value we want.
Like this?
Like that. And I think you may have an extra. No, that's correct. Yeah. And right. So in the body,
is an object, if I sort of indent it this way.
Yeah, that looks correct to me now. And I believe if we actually are just in here, right? So if you pop that open, if you hit enter just to open up that brace, I believe we can now just return an object. So if you want to return, right? So you do need to return it, right? If you want to remove the return statement, that's a different thing, right?
Yeah. So I need to return. And then this object would be something like course. Actually, it would be. Let's see. How did it look over here?
I believe we were just reflecting the values back.
Yes. There we go. So it should look like this, basically.
Yep, that looks fine to me.
Okay.
So something like that, right?
Yes. Now,
and technically, yeah.
Question though, the JSON, does that return it as a string or does it return it as an object?
So we can go and verify based on how it's used if it's treated as a string, right? So if we go back to the implementation and not the test,
right?
Yeah. So we go back to implementation here, right? And we see that we actually immediately treat it as a object.
Do we?
It is an object at the outset. So
I'm not sure that it is, but we'll see. Because I think with the .json, it comes back, and I think we treat that as a string, which we then pass in.
So it's not taking. So it likely takes. So I can tell you from the spec. JSON returns an object. Also, if you hover over JSON, if you hover over JSON, it'll tell you. Right. So it's a promise any, right? It's not a promise string.
Okay, got it. All right. So you are correct. So then that means that this should be correct because it's returning an object rather than the string. Okay.
Yeah, and it's actually and there's actually one more how to put this. There's actually like one more twist to this, right?
Okay.
Is that JSON is asynchronous.
Okay.
So the reason you were seeing that weird promise thing before is because technically JSON actually doesn't just return a value.
Uh-huh.
Because if you pass JSON a really long body,
yes,
it needs time to parse.
Got it.
So that's actually where we can still get around this. Like we can still mock this correctly,
Yes.
but we may have actually just discovered a bug in the implementation.
Okay.
Right? Because JSON, so the way we fix it in the mock value is we just declare this function as async.
So just
and even though it looks async right there,
right.
And even though JSON is looks like in the body it's returning just a value, because the function itself is asynchronous, the return automatically gets wrapped in a promise.
Yes. And so the bug.
So that will handle the.
Sorry, go ahead.
So the bug is actually in the So the bug is actually in the implementation right here. If we go to basic course search form, we actually cannot just immediately use JSON. We actually need to do one more await, right?
Got it. So do we need to basically do like this?
Yeah, and the good news is that await in general, so we do need to do it like that because technically fetch URL is a promise, not the object, right? So this is one way to do it. I might be able to dig around for a better way to do this, but I don't know off the top of my head what the proper way to do this is.
Okay.
So that's this is a method that we can use. So
all right.
So now if we do it, right, if we go back to the, let's see, so that looks good here. If we go back to the test, right, now that the fetch has been mocked, we can now verify that on the screen there is something with the following text, right? And what we do need to be a little bit careful of how we do this. So I think we should go and look at in the example in the running code how it's currently being done. Okay.
So if I change one of these.
So if you inspect the course JSON element, that element with course JSON.
This one here.
Yeah, I'm curious what its internals look like.
Got it.
Because this is what could make it very difficult. So you see here how the values are spread out over multiple different HTML elements. This makes matching things fairly difficult.
However, let me interrupt for a second because this is not what it's going to look. I mean, this is not what it's going to look like eventually at all.
Yes.
I'm wondering if our work might be done here in the sense that we might find that if we just run this test now, we are exercising basically all of this code. We are doing a handle submit in a test.
This is actually, no, it's actually even better than that. Remember, this basic course search form is actually not responsible for displaying the data.
That's right.
It's only responsible for calling a very specific thing, which is called set course JSON.
That's right.
And so here's the best part.
All we really need to do is check whether the course JSON is the correct value, right?
Almost. What we need to do is, we need to verify that set course JSON was called with the value that we mocked.
Okay.
Right. Now, this is where it actually gets a little bit interesting because as if it hasn't been interesting already. You notice how when we render basic course search form, we don't pass it anything.
Right.
Which is a little bit actually different than how we actually use it, right? Because we do actually pass it set course JSON typically as a function. Right? And if we want to verify that a function is being called, there's actually a really good pattern for this.
Got it. So stop a second, because I think I want to make sure that I understood and that the people watching understood what you just said. If we look for basic course search form in the actual, like where it's actually being used, like this is here, what I'm doing is I'm defining a component. Here I'm running tests for that component. but where is this component used? I was doing a search, but and let me get rid of this because that's actually confusing things. But I know where it is.
It's in home.js.
Yeah, it's in home.js.
Yeah.
So let's just go look at home.js. And what you'll see is that when it's actually used, we pass in a parameter, which is a set course JSON function.
Yes.
And the reason we do that is because we want that state for the course JSON to be kept here on the home page component. There it is, right? That's the initial state we have, which is just the placeholder. If I refresh this and reload the page from scratch, that's the placeholder text, which gets replaced. And so what we really want to do is we want to test that that function, that course JSON, gets called with the JSON that comes back, right?
Precisely.
Got it. All right.
And this is actually very straightforward to do.
Good.
With Jest.
Got it.
So what we're going to do is we're going to create what's called a Jest function.
Okay.
And a Jest function is known by a number of different names. The most common of them is like a spy or a mock function or a magic function. So I think we'll go with the terminology of spy. But the idea is that this function doesn't actually have any implementation unless we tell it to. But what it does record is how many times it was called and what it was called with, which is exceedingly valuable because that's how we can verify that the function was exercised correctly.
And does it keep track of what was passed?
Exactly. You can, so it'll tell you how many times it was called, and it'll have an array of the times it was called, and and in each of those elements, it'll have an array of elements that it was passed.
Got it. So what we're probably going to do, let me guess, we're going to create one of these spies. We're going to pass it in as the parameter for, if we go back and look at our home page.
I think it's set course JSON. You can also look at the implementation of basic course search form and go up to the declaration.
Yeah,
the very top of the declaration.
Right. Okay, so let me go back to our implementation, and we can also see here it's the parameter when we okay. So we're going to, in our test, we're going to have here set course JSON equals, and then something, and that's our spy, basically.
Exactly. Our spy, right? So if we go up a line above, right, we can say const our spy equals jest.fn and then call it like a function. And you call it like a function, like that, exactly.
And that, is it just that?
That's it.
Okay.
That's how you declare a Jest function, right?
And then we're going to assert down here, assert that our spy was called, and we passed in basically what?
Well, ideally, we want to pass in that object that we mocked. So actually, I think it'd be helpful if we extracted that into a variable really quickly.
Got it.
Line 40.
Yes. If we basically just take this thing and come up and call it
just above it,
const, and we'll call it sample JSON, or sample sample return value equals.
Yep, and now we can replace the return value with that.
Got it. Okay.
Yep. And now if we go on down, right to the bottom, we can go ahead and write on line 64 or wherever, we can say expect, and let me see if I can get the docs for this, because I don't remember off the top of my head. I think it's expect our spy. So you pass our spy to that. And you want to say to have been called with, all camel case.
And it's probably going to be
And
something called with sample return value.
precisely. Now, we shall see. Oh, you just deleted a bunch of braces. You might want to undo that a couple of times.
Yes.
And get those braces back.
There we go. Sample return value. Boom.
Now, we shall see if this works. You need to be cautious whenever you're mocking and expecting things about asynchronous values and asynchronous functions, because now there's no guarantee of like linearity. There's no guarantee of like things happening in order. So our expect might actually come before that any of those promises resolve.
Right.
Which would be bad.
Yes. Right. Yeah.
So
like,
we will let's go ahead and run the test and see the behavior. And we will deal with this. We will deal with the fallout if there is any.
Not to assert this expectation until all of the async promises are resolved. Right?
Yep.
Got it. All right, let's see what happens when we run it. And just for the record, we're at 59.09 before we made these changes. Let's see what happens. Okay, we had one failed test, so let's look at that first. Expected.
You'll need to scroll up to the top. Yeah, there we go.
Yeah. Okay. When I click submit, expect this to have been called with expected. That's what expected is, but it was never called. Right.
Yeah, so it was never called, right? And the
however,
primary reason would be.
However, we now have 100% test coverage. Yay!
Yeah, so this is an interesting case where you can get 100% test coverage, but not have actually
passed the test.
Like pass the test.
Right.
And also, Jest coverage gets a little bit weird when you have failed tests. So that's why, generally speaking, you don't trust test coverage on a failed test.
Right.
So what we need to do here, so my hypothesis is that the reason our spy is not being called is because the Jest functions have not yet resolved.
Right.
Sorry, the asynchronous functions have not yet resolved. Yeah. So luckily, there's a lot of times this will come up in testing a React app, because React apps are inherently asynchronous. They have render loops. There's all sorts of like ugly things where it's like you need to wait for something.
Yes. Yes.
And luckily, one of the properties that testing library gives us is the ability to wait for a condition.
Yes.
Right. So what we can actually do is we can, if we go up to, and give me a moment to find the reference for this. I believe we can import this from testing library React. So it's like render comma wait for, and it's camel case wait for.
There it is.
Precisely. So what we want to do is now go down to there, right? And before the expect, we want to wait for. And what we're going to do is we're going to wait for. And so you'll see here that there's this callback that you pass it, right? So we want to pass it a function. And in that function, you need an expectation that you want to wait to be true.
Okay.
Right. And so what we want to expect, what we want to,
as the parameter,
so we don't pass it anything.
Okay.
We don't pass it anything.
Got it.
Right. And what we're gonna wait for is we're gonna wait for expect our spy to have been called times 1.
To have been called
times. Yeah, this is how you express how many times it's been called.
1, like
and
that?
1. Yep,
okay.
Like that.
Got it.
And I believe, and what we want to do is we actually want, in this case, we can do, give me a moment. So you're going to want to actually nix the braces around it, because we want it to implicitly return its value. And then what we're going to do is we're actually going to await the wait for, because that's how we're going to force our expectation to wait for that to be true.
So I don't need braces or a semicolon.
You don't,
because that's
yeah,
now
you don't need the semicolon.
right.
And we want to await this.
Got it.
Now, this is going to make our test go asynchronous.
There you go, right? Yeah, it's not my first video. So just to be
you
clear.
You don't put async there. You don't put async there. You put async as the second parameter.
Got it, right. Yeah. Got it, because this is the actual function. Got it. So just to be clear, anytime you've got an await inside here, that makes the function asynchronous. And the second parameter to test is this arrow function. Async goes in front of the set of parentheses where the parameters would
exactly.
Got it.
Test takes the name of the test and the actual body of the test, and you've now declared the body to be asynchronous, which is not a bad thing. It just needs to know.
Okay.
So hopefully that will address the test failure.
Give it a try. Okay, so our test passed. We have 100% coverage. We're going to do a get status. We're going to do a get add. We're going to do a get status. We're going to do a get diff minus stage to see what we're about to commit. So what have we done? We have we fixed, first of all, what's really, really good about this is that I was ready to push this code into the main branch. Then I got held up by the fact that the CI system gave me a red X because I didn't meet the testing threshold. In the process of doing the testing, we discovered what could have been a really bad bug, which was that sometimes when we click the submit button here, instead of seeing this course JSON, what I was seeing was you have a promise, which meant that we were basically that we were displaying this before the promise had resolved. In the process of writing the test, we found that bug and fixed it by putting an extra await around here. Then here we put into our form a data test ID just as an illustration of that as a technique. But then for the other tests, we didn't do that. We used a different approach. Here is all of our testing code. So that's the whole, we've been through all of that. So I'm not going to walk through that. I think we are ready to do a get commit minus mpcsc, add test coverage for the basic course search form component and fix a bug. The bug was that we were not always waiting for one of the promises to resolve. We added an extra async. By the way, this, when you do a commit, you should always start with a one-line summary. If you have more to say, you leave a blank line and then you just type the rest of it. And you just don't end your double quote until you're all done. Now I'm going to get push origin with my branch name. And that should take care of that. We are going to hope that when this goes through CI, we get a green check. We're not going to wait for that as part of the video. We're going to go ahead and end the video here. So in this video, you saw how when you have a failed CI test, and I'll just show that again. We were on GitHub here under the UCSB courses search repo, and we had a pull request here. That pull request, it's now yellow because it's running through CI again, but before this was a red X. And the problem we had was test coverage. We ran npm, we cd'd into our JavaScript directory and did npm run coverage to see the problem. And then we iterated by writing tests until we got to an acceptable coverage threshold, which in this case was 100%. So thank you, Scott, for walking us through that. And thank you all for watching.